The smell came first, faint, distant, almost easy to ignore. Then the wind shifted, and within minutes the air itself felt different, thick and warm in a way it had never been before. By the time he actually saw the orange glow on the horizon, the decision that would determine whether he lived through the next hour had already needed to be made. What happened in the minutes after that is not the story most people imagine when they picture an ancient forest fire. And by the end of this, you will understand why running was often the worst possible choice. Stay through this one, because the actual survival method used here goes against almost everything modern instinct would tell you to do. To understand what a forest fire meant to an ancient human, you first have to understand how differently fire behaved without any of the containment tools we take for granted today. There were no fire breaks, no water trucks, no warning systems. A fire could start from a single lightning strike on dry ground, depending on wind and vegetation, spread across enormous distances in a matter of hours. For someone living directly inside that landscape, a wildfire was not a distant news event. It was something that could arrive at his camp with almost no warning at all. The first real sign was rarely the flames themselves. It was smoke, carried on the wind long before the fire was anywhere close. An experienced ancient human learned to read that smoke carefully. Thick, dark, low-hanging smoke often meant the fire was burning slowly through dense material and moving in a more predictable direction. Thin, fast-moving smoke stretched across the sky suggested the fire was burning hot and moving quickly, driven hard by wind, which meant far less time to react. Wind direction mattered more than almost anything else in this situation. Ancient humans who lived in fire-prone regions appear to have developed a strong, almost automatic awareness of which way the wind was blowing at all times, not out of idle curiosity, but because that single detail could mean the difference between having hours to prepare or having only minutes. If the wind was blowing the fire directly toward the camp, everything changed immediately. Here is where most people expect running away to be the obvious answer, and this is exactly where ancient survival logic gets more complicated. Running directly away from a fire, especially through dry brush or uneven terrain, could be extremely dangerous. Fire can move faster than a person can run, particularly when wind is pushing it forward across grassland or dry underbrush. An ancient human sprinting blindly away from smoke could actually run directly into the fire's path if he misjudged its direction, since flames driven by shifting wind do not always spread in a straight line. Instead, one of the most consistent survival strategies appears to have involved moving sideways relative to the fire's direction rather than straight away from it. By moving perpendicular to the wind, an ancient human could get out of the fire's direct path without needing to outrun the flames themselves, since he only needed to get clear of the fire's width rather than escape its overall spread. This single adjustment in direction could turn an impossible sprint into a manageable, controlled escape. Water sources became critical almost immediately. Ancient humans, who knew their surrounding landscape, often had a mental map of the nearest river, stream, or even a large muddy area, and heading toward water, rather than simply running away from fire, gave a far higher chance of survival. Submerging in water, or even lying in wet mud along a riverbank, could protect against radiant heat, even if the fire eventually passed nearby, since water conducts heat away from the body far more effectively than dry ground ever could. Now think about this for a moment. If you were standing at your camp and smelled smoke on the wind, with no phone, no warning system, and no idea exactly how far away the fire actually was, what do you think your first instinct would tell you to do? Grab what you could carry and run in a straight line? Head for water instead? Or try to judge the wind first before moving at all? Leave your answer below, because the choices people imagine here usually say a lot about how they weigh speed against direction under real pressure. Elevated, exposed rock areas served another important purpose. Fire needs fuel to keep spreading, and large rocky outcrops with little vegetation could not burn. Ancient humans, who managed to reach these kinds of exposed stone areas, in time could wait out a fire's passage in relative safety. since flames moving across a landscape with no fuel to consume would typically slow dramatically or stop entirely at the edge of bare rock. Breathing became one of the most dangerous parts of the entire event, often more dangerous than the flames themselves. Smoke inhalation could cause serious harm long before heat or fire ever reached a person directly. Ancient humans appear to have instinctively covered their mouths and noses with any available material, whether that meant a piece of hide, leaves, or simply an arm pressed against the face, in an attempt to filter at least some of the thick smoke before it reached their lungs. Staying low to the ground also mattered more than people typically realize. Heat and smoke naturally rise, meaning the air closest to the ground, even during an active fire, was often somewhat cooler and slightly clearer than the air, just a few feet higher. Ancient humans, moving through smoke-heavy areas, likely crouched lower instinctively, without necessarily understanding the exact reason why it helped, simply because it felt easier to breathe and see while doing so. There is a physical detail about fire behavior that most people never consider, and it changes how urgent this situation really was. Heat from a large wildfire does not need direct flame contact to cause serious harm. Radiant heat alone, traveling ahead of the actual fire line, could become dangerous at a distance, still considered relatively safe from flames themselves. This meant an ancient human judging safety purely by whether he could see fire directly in front of him was working with incomplete information. The danger zone extended well beyond the visible flame line, and groups who understood this, likely through painful past experience, kept far greater distance than instinct alone would have suggested was necessary. Time of day played a surprisingly large role as well. Wildfires often behaved differently depending on whether they occurred during the heat of the afternoon or the cooler hours of early morning and evening. Afternoon fires, fueled by higher temperatures and drier air, tended to move faster and more unpredictably. Fires that started or slowed during cooler hours gave ancient humans a slightly wider window to react, relocate, or reach safety before conditions worsened again with the next day's heat. Groups with enough seasonal experience likely factored this into how urgently they responded the moment smoke was first spotted. The type of terrain a group lived near also shaped their entire approach to fire danger. Communities living near dense forest with thick undergrowth faced a genuinely different threat than those living in more open grassland. Dense forest fires tended to burn hotter and produce far more smoke, making navigation and breathing significantly harder. Open grassland fires often moved faster across open ground, but produced comparatively less smoke, meaning visibility, while still poor, was rarely as severe. Groups who lived their entire lives in one terrain type developed instincts calibrated specifically to that environment, which is part of why relocating to an unfamiliar landscape could be so dangerous during a fire. Since a survival instinct built around one terrain type did not always translate safely to another. If this part surprised you, that staying low and moving sideways mattered more than simply running fast, that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it shows how much of ancient survival depended on reading a situation correctly rather than reacting with raw panic. Group behavior during a wildfire also revealed something important about ancient cooperation. A group that scattered in different directions during a fire risked losing members entirely, since reuniting afterward in a landscape reshaped by fire and thick smoke could be nearly impossible. Groups that had clear, previously understood meeting points, often a specific rock formation or a known river bend, had a much better chance of reuniting safely once the immediate danger had passed, even if individuals had been forced to take slightly different paths to safety. Animals played an unexpected role in how some ancient humans navigated a wildfire. Fleeing animals, moving in a consistent direction away from the fire, could act as a rough, involuntary guide for humans uncertain of the fire's exact position. An ancient human who noticed multiple animal species suddenly moving the same direction likely understood, even without formal reasoning, that following that same direction gave him a reasonable chance of also moving away from the danger. The aftermath of a forest fire created its own set of challenges that lasted long after the flames were gone. Familiar landmarks could be unrecognizable, hunting grounds temporarily stripped of cover and food sources, and water sources sometimes contaminated with ash and debris. Groups that survived the fire itself still had to navigate a landscape that had fundamentally changed overnight, often needing to relocate temporarily until vegetation and animal populations began to recover. Interestingly, not every ancient group treated forest fires as purely destructive events. Some evidence suggests certain groups eventually recognized that burned areas, once vegetation began regrowing, could attract new animal activity and fresh plant growth that had been suppressed by dense overgrowth before the fire. This does not mean ancient humans deliberately set fires with this outcome in mind in every case. But it does suggest that groups with enough generational experience around fire-prone landscapes gradually developed a more complex relationship with fire than pure fear alone. This complexity is worth remembering whenever we picture ancient humans facing a wildfire. It was not simply a story of terrified people running blindly from flames. It involved real, calculated decisions about direction, elevation, breathing, and group coordination, built entirely from lived experience passed down without any written record. Every successful escape likely reinforced specific behaviors within a group, while every failure almost certainly cost lives in ways that shaped how seriously future generations treated the earliest signs of smoke on the horizon. There is one more detail worth mentioning before we close. The men who managed to lead their group safely through a fire, choosing the right direction, spotting water quickly, or reading smoke correctly under pressure, likely gained lasting respect within their community. Not because of strength or speed, but because calm, accurate judgment during exactly this kind of chaos was rare, and everyone present understood how much it had actually mattered. So the next time you picture an ancient human facing a wall of smoke and flame in the distance, remember that survival rarely came down to pure speed. It came down to reading wind, choosing direction carefully, knowing where water was, and trusting decisions built from experience rather than panic, and in many cases, those exact decisions were the only thing standing between an entire group and total disaster. If this kind of detail is exactly what you come here for, this channel is built entirely around moments like this, the specific decisions and instincts that never make it into the usual retelling of ancient human life. The small details that actually determined who made it out and who did not, and staying around means you will not miss the next one.